Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
You just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're going to lose. Coming down the stretch, you're going to lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here to talk about MSU's upcoming game against its rival, the Michigan Wolverines in Ann Arbor, on Saturday night. Michigan State is going for the season sweep, which will be the first time since 2019. Also, the overall series is getting pretty close to being tied up at 97-89. Before we begin, a special thanks to Doug Robinson, who joined the Draymond Green level on Patreon. Thanks a lot, Doug. We really appreciate you and everyone else who supports the show through one-time gifts or recurring gifts. If you love the show and want to show us a little late Valentine's love, go on over to tffinots.com/support to get the links. Well, the last time these two teams met, Michigan State was 4-5 in the league, and at some point early in the year, they actually were tied for Michigan last place, and they've crawled their way up all the way to tied for fourth now. Michigan, however, has continued its downward spiral, except for an inexplicable win at Chrysler over the Badgers. There's plenty of talk amongst the dozen or so Michigan basketball fans on the future of Juwan Howard, and so that's certainly one of the things we'll be talking about today. Michigan State is 8-17 overall, 3-11 in the Big Ten, coming off the 29-point loss to Illinois. But like I mentioned, they did win their last game by 4 over Wisconsin, who's been in a free fall. The Wolverines are 103rd in KenPom and 96th in the net, one spot ahead of Minnesota. So, unless they win the Big Ten tournament, they pretty much are finished for the season. On offense, they're 68th overall, which isn't terrible. But it's a lot worse than the first time they played in East Lansing. They've been good for three-point shooting team at 36.3%, but pretty mediocre inside the arc at 148th. They're a decent team offensive rebounding at 87th, but have really struggled with turnovers, and they turned the ball over a lot. They're 224th. They've shot free throws decently, but only that is 71%, and they don't get there very often at 193rd ranking for free throw attempts to field goal attempts. And the defense has been crazy bad. They are 180th in the country, which is the worst defensive team in the league in the KenPom era. They give up 36% from three to opponents, although they do limit attempts at 49th. Then they're 204th against twos, which also is awful. They're a bad defensive rebounding team at 266th. They don't turn anybody over, and are one of the 10 worst teams in America in steal percentage. They're 95th in free throw attempts to field goal attempts by opponents, so they don't foul quite as much as they have before, but overall, pretty miserable. And I think they're easily now much worse in Iowa, which is saying something. They're slow overall. They're slow in offense, 214th and 214th in length of offensive possession. Opponents have been played relatively fast against them at 72nd in length of average offensive possession against. And so paints a pretty dismal picture of a team that's had a pretty dismal season.
Yeah, and obviously one of the first things you think about is Michigan as a home team versus a road team, over the last several weeks. That's been defined by, does Dug McDaniel's play or not? Because when they go on the road, apparently his ability to, quote, Tony Soprano, crack a book, or
do those travel? Can you take books on buses?
One of my favorite lines from The Sopranos is, as an aside, is it happened several times over the course of the series, is when Tony gets upset with his son AJ and yells at him to crack a book. But needless to say, Doug hasn't been doing enough of that. That's why he's sitting out road games. This is a game at Chrysler, so he is expected to play. But that weird win over Wisconsin about a week or so ago aside, they haven't been much better, if at all, with him than without him.
Yeah.
So you can't really say, well, they're a totally different team. No, they're a different team in one sense. The turnover number, I think, is a little worse probably than what we can expect to see on Saturday night because they are markedly different. I mean, when they don't have him, they have no point guard. They just don't have him.
Right.
Jaden Llewellyn's numbers, as we'll get into, are awful, and he's the closest thing they've got. So it's a better picture in that respect. But look, offensively, this is maybe a little. I expected them to struggle offensively coming into the season, relatively speaking. But
yeah.
I would say, where they are now, where they were before the first game, they were 47th in overall offensive efficiency. That was definitely better than I expected. Where they're at now is getting closer to what I would have expected. Maybe a shade better, but they're not a great offensive team regardless. The turnover numbers kill them. They don't shoot well from two at all. What saves them is they're a decent three-point shooting team, and they're a decent offensive rebounding team, so they do generate second chances. Those are really the things they do well. Defensively, as you've said, we're getting into territory that is very rarely touched on by a Big Ten
Uncharted.
team. There's a chance, a real chance that they could end up outside the top 200 in defensive efficiency. That is beyond what you would ever expect possible from a Big Ten team. And it's team-wide. We talked about this before the first game. They brought in some guys. Namari Bennett and Olivier Camois were both guys who came from solid defensive programs and who had very good reputations as individual defenders. And then you had Dickinson's minutes, where he was very rough defensively for the most part, were being replaced by Terrace Reed, who showed a lot on that end as a freshman. I was convinced they were going to be a pretty good defensive team. They have been anything but. Not only been up and pretty good, they've been one of the worst teams in the conference over the entirety of the Ken Pom era, which is whatever it is, 22 years, 23 years now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. It's stunning. And they're a horrendous defensive rebounding team. They are horrendous against twos. Their saving grace against threes is they limit attempts pretty well. But this is a
because
team
twos are easy.
yeah. So their profile is somewhat, it shares some similarities with Penn State, except in some respects it's much worse. They have gotten a little better at avoiding fouling than they were before the first game, so you give them that. But this is that they don't force turnovers at all. So this is a rough group defensively. There's no two ways about that. And they allow people to play fast against them. So you know what that length of average offensive possession against is reflected by. And we saw this at times in the first game. They are a terrible transition defense team, just awful. And so teams are able to generally, Illinois did that. I didn't look at the box score to see how many points in transition Illinois scored, but they put up almost 100. So, you can read the writing on the wall with that one, right? There's just nothing you can point to defensively that's something to hang your hat on. It's just a bad picture.
Yeah, this season has obviously been not what they expected. It's been multitudes worse than anyone probably anticipated. It started, of course, with Juwan Howard not even coaching because he had surgery, and then he came back as an assistant and somehow got himself thrown out of a game as an assistant coach.
Yeah.
and then Dug McDaniel gets the suspension for 6 away games. It's been just a weird,
you're missing
a bad season just gotten worse.
You're not even capturing all of it. Then he handed the baton and let Phil Martelli become the head coach for the game at the Palestra against Penn State. He had the altercation with strength and conditioning coach John Sanderson, who's been this guy that the program and its fans talk about as if he's God for years. And it's so bad that Sanderson gets reassigned still in the athletic department, but he gets reassigned. He's not working with the basketball team anymore.
Yeah.
So that's on top of everything else you just said. And by the way, they might not win double-digit games overall, and they are in last place in the Big Ten, which I believe, I can't remember what the specific year was, but I want to say it was some point in the 60s. Was the last time? Yeah,
like 40 years, 50 years ago.
The last time they finished dead last in the conference. That's a very distinct possibility for this team.
Yeah, and with that Sanderson situation too, I mean, as an aside, there is the way it sort of worked itself out that he just got transferred to a different part of the athletic department. To me, tells me that for sure it was Howard initiated. Howard was the one who's responsible, but they couldn't obviously get rid of Sanderson because normally if you have someone who is a much lower position get into an altercation with the head coach, the guy in the lower position is gone. I mean, he's just finished.
You make a good
so
point.
Unless
you make a good point, that does smack of an HR move, doesn't it?
Oh, it's an HR move for sure. He just we'll reassign you. This way you don't have to deal with Howard and his kids or whatever. You don't sue us. We would have unlawful. On what's the firing. It's not. I can't think the term, but basically you're not allowed to fire someone because of it's unfair.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like for sure that's what happened. What actually happened as far as whether it was just verbal or was physical or who knows.
Yeah.
But that for a department that's that came out and said it's a zero policy, a zero tolerance policy for anger. Clearly that's not true. It couldn't be. But whatever.
And here's the thing. We're recording this on Thursday night. Yesterday, Wednesday, Ward Manuel, the athletic director at Michigan, he was asked and responded in some detail to what his position is on the basketball program. And to my eyes, it, sometimes say, well, the dreaded, message of support is the kiss of death, right?
Yes.
I don't think so here. It's been certainly bandied about in rumor land all year, or since things turned really sour, that Howard would not be fired. And I read that statement. I don't see any indication. I think what they're likely to do is to say, look, this year was kind of cursed and star-crossed from the beginning because of his health problems. And we're not going to hold him responsible for everything that happened this year. We're going to give him one more chance. Let's think back to, what they did with their football program in the aftermath of a terrible 2020 season. Now, granted, it was a COVID year, blah, 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 but it was a bad year. And before that, Jim Harbaugh had not been bad, but he hadn't done what he was brought there to do. He hadn't beaten Ohio State. He hadn't won a Big Ten championship. He hadn't been in the playoffs. So there was a real strong current among the Michigan fan base that this guy is a failure. He's got to go. I mean, that's the history a lot of them don't want to revisit, but that's the truth. What did they do? Well, they brought him back. They did some weird cutting of his salary, but they brought him back. And, in a normal place, like let's look at Ohio State as a contrast. I think Chris Holtmann probably did enough to lose his job. I've been talking about it for 4 years. It finally happened. But by comparison to what's happened at Michigan, Chris Holtmann has never publicly embarrassed the school. Juwan Howard, we're starting to lose count how many times it's happened. And Chris Holtmann had, the last 2 years have been rough, but the last 2 years at Michigan have been rough. So before that, I would say Holtmann, he didn't hit the highs that Howard hit, but I think he had a steadier performance. And Ohio State moved on him, right? So they wait for the season to end. I just, knowing how Michigan institutionally views basketball, I'm not going to say I'm 100% convinced, but I've tipped over the 50% mark that he's going to be back for at least one more year. I think I just don't. I could be wrong, but and God help them if they fire, because I'm telling you, on the one hand, as a Michigan State fan, I think the downside with that is we know what we've got with Juwan Howard. You're not worried about him. They could luck into somebody good, or at least better than what they've had. But on the other hand, you look at that list that Ohio State has got that we talked about in our last episode a little bit, and it's just replete with high major coaches. And I think the feeling seems to be that, at least for now, they'll likely land somebody at that level. Or maybe a Dusty May, which would basically be about the same thing, because that guy's going to have, he's going to be able to name a high major job, essentially, up on the available ones, I don't think that's going to be the case for Michigan. I really don't. Now, I could be wrong, and, there could be somebody out there who's in a spot where they're not getting along with their athletic director, or where they don't feel there's enough NIL support or whatever, but that's the thing. It's how Michigan views basketball historically. The NIL situation there is reportedly rough. I mean, look, they lost Hunter Dickinson. That tells you part of the story, where it's at. And then they also, to compound it, they have regular issues with admissions. So you can't even promise a coach, hey, you're going to be able to build through the portal here, which is going to be something whoever's coaching that team next year has to do. They have no choice. They've only got 3 high school recruits that are slated to come in. They're going to lose a bunch of guys, and they got to somehow find a way to get better, right? So the portal would be a necessity, but they're more limited than any other team in the Big Ten. If you look at how their admissions process works, and then you're compounding it with a questionable NIL situation, where exactly is the path? Is it, get a degree from Michigan? Get serious, It's not. Yeah. It's just it's a bad situation. So I look at that and I think, they're in a year where they just had to replace their football coach, and they're doing it with a holdover on the staff, and then he took a bunch of the rest of the staff. That's a big deal, even coming off that national title. Do they really have the stomach, the appetite for an attempt to reinvent the basketball program when we know that institutionally that has challenges? I'm not buying it. Not yet.
Yeah.
Now, if Michigan State goes in there and runs a train on them on Saturday night, maybe that changes. Maybe that's enough to move the dial. But for right now, like I said, I'm at least a little bit over 50% that he stays. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing if you're a Michigan State fan. You love hearing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can talk yourself in any scenario, because you can say, well, they're going to likely just wait till the end of the season, because obviously they had ample opportunities throughout the season to get rid of Juwan Howard, and they're just deciding to wait. But with the change of the football team, you can do this now and no one really notices. You can have him walk away for health reasons. There are all kinds of ways you can sort of find the door and get it done. I don't know. I mean, there's no way any of us can know. And I think it may just be, it might just be dependent on how he finishes the season, right? If they continue this slide where they just win like 2 more games, then maybe he's gone, but maybe Ward's like, okay, I'll give you some more time. But because you're Fab Five, I'll give you more time.
Here's what I do. I mean, I would argue that, not to belabor this thing, but I would argue that the ample opportunities that have been presented to get rid of them and that they haven't done it tells you that they're not that likely to do it.
Right.
There's that spin on it too. But I just don't get that feel that they're ready to make that kind of move. And if they do it, I'm telling you, I would be shocked if they are able to convince an established, good high major coach to take that job. I think they would have to go in the mid-major ranks, and that might end up working out, because you can catch lightning in a bottle and you get the right guy. So I am on team retain Juwan Howard. Make no mistake. But we'll see. You're right that none of us can know until we know. But just handicapping it, let's put it this way. I think it's more likely that Indiana fires Mike Woodson than Michigan firing Juwan Howard. If I had to put money on it, that between those two choices, that's where I put my money.
Yeah. We'll have a different feel for things in about 2 weeks. Because, if Michigan loses by double digits every game for the next 2 weeks, if their team looks like they've given up, then maybe they'll leave Ward Manuel with no choice.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe Michigan goes in. Here's the other thing that argues against that, though, is that I keep coming back to the same point. that school doesn't care about basketball enough. They don't. You can say, well, if they just continue getting embarrassed like this, so what? You got that fan base doing everything it can right now to deny that the sport of basketball even exists. It truly is amazing. Like I've said this conversation I've had with people. Like, for as bad and as tough as this football season was to go through as a Michigan State fan, I still watched every game. And most people I know did the same. Now, was attendance at Spartan Stadium hit? Sure it was. Not like it is at Chrysler, though. Not even close. and the idea of just basically switching off, which, by the way, some of their media, some of the media, I'm not talking about the free press or the news, but I mean some of the internet, the online media that exists in this ecosystem to cover the University of Michigan, they'll say as a point, the guy who runs the MGO blog, which is one of maybe the biggest of their internet sites, said as a matter of fact in a recent game that he didn't bother to watch it. I can't even imagine that. I can't imagine it. But it's said as if it's a perfectly acceptable response and thing to do. So the upshot of all of that is you could say, well, if they keep losing games by double digits and they only win one more game, let's say, or none the rest of the way, that it'll be too embarrassing. They'll have to fire him. I'm not convinced of that, because to get to that point means you got to have a certain constituency willing to hold the feet of the AD to the fire. I don't see any evidence
donors,
of that.
right? To buy out contracts and get new coaches. Yeah.
It's just flash forward, God help us all, to a situation where Tom Izzo's successor, whomever that might be, is struggling through a season like this. How long would it take Matt Ishbia to be, not just Matt, other people too, but just use him as an example. There's no Matt Ishbia lurking for Michigan in that basketball program. None. Does not exist. It's funny because the only period that this stuff went on, it's funny to think about, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s too, Michigan cheated their asses off. They're one of the worst violators of NCAA rules when it comes to paying people, buying players, that there was in the country. And that's verifiable because the Fab Five scandal is, in terms of financial impact, I believe still the biggest in NCAA history. So, but it's funny to me as I look back at it and I think, and yet nobody really has ever cared about this program, and yet they were doing that. Where did those guys go? I mean, I know where Ed Martin went. He died. But where did the rest of it? Where did the guys that were dropping off bags of money at the lamplighter in the 80s go? What happened to those guys? I don't know.
On some level, though, too, don't you think those guys are getting paid in other ways? Like, I think that was like a financial decision for a lot of those guys. And
were. Yeah.
It was almost a business decision versus handing over, donating.
The bottom line is, man, I mean, Michigan's got, problems. I know they had some big announcement yesterday. They think they got their NIL problem solved, but I'll believe that when I see it, because I think there's some institutional stuff there that they may not be passed yet. But regardless of what happens, that's football stuff. They're not, people were talking about the Ohio State job, and I've seen enough people, both national and otherwise, comment on this to believe it's true, that relating to Ohio State, that Sean Miller, is a name that's been bandied about, who's currently at Xavier. From what I've heard, it seems like the NIL program at Xavier is in better shape than it is at Ohio State. And Ohio State historically does a better job of supporting their basketball program than Michigan does. So what does that tell you it's like at Michigan?
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right, well,
it's a bad,
let's go through the lineups
team,
here.
Man. It's a bad basketball team. That's
let's
reality.
Go through the teams here. First brought to you by the Brothers Just Gutters, sponsoring the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. The Brothers will take care of your gutter work, obviously. I don't know about you on the other side of the state, but we got 5 inches of snow, which I was totally unprepared for this morning as I was driving to work.
We didn't get 5, but I was unprepared. Yeah.
There's a bus blocking the exit ramp, so I had to drive around it in order to get to the hospital. So anyway, we managed to get to where we need to go. But, that snow is going to melt, and that melting water, it's got to go somewhere. And so you want to make sure it goes to the right place. And so make sure your gutters are functioning properly, your downspouts, and the outspouts that push it away from your house. If that's messed up, it's going to cause all kinds of problems. So you want to make sure that's taken care of. The Brothers Adjuster Gutters on both the east and west side of the state can take care of that, so you don't have to worry about it. They give you great pricing. They come in any time of the weather. Right now, they'll come out and do the work. So they'll do a great job. You get 10% off if you mention Final Four when you go get your estimate. You can find all that information at our support page at the Final Fours on theschedule.com/support. All right, so we'll begin with starter Dug McDaniel. That's Doug with 1G, a 6-foot guard averaging 16.8 points a game on 43, 36, and 79 shooting. Also averaging 4.7 assists per game and a little bit above a 2-to-1 assist-to-turnover ratio. So anyway, I still have never understood the DUG. I don't know if that's like a family thing or what that's all about, but anyway.
Look, he makes them better offensively. There's no two ways about that. If you watch them on the road, it's a real struggle. I mean, Llewellyn nominally plays the point. They've got other guys like Burnett and Camwa who really make more plays, but it's a struggle without him. So at least with little Dougie, you've got a real point guard out there, and he's a capable shooter, so he can score himself. I would say this. His numbers offensively look better than it feels when I'm watching him, because I think his shot selection is questionable sometimes. He does a lot of something that has been done with regularity at Michigan going back to the Beeline era, which is small guards who throw up a lot of slop at the rim and somehow get it to fall. I mean, you remember those half hooks that
Xavier
Simpson used to hit.
Yeah.
Even Derek Walton did some of that. And then some of the guys, Mike Smith, some of the guys they brought in since then. And Doug does a little bit of that, but sometimes he forces that stuff. And just his shot selection in general, I don't think is great. And he's a capable creator and assist guy because he's fast, and he's also able to vary speed, so he can create separation at times. But I don't think he's a great playmaker. He's not an elite guy in that area. He's solid, and he's by light years, the best option they've got. So he'll make them better offensively in a lot of ways. But defensively, he's truly awful. I mean, and you look at a guy like that, you would think, well, at a minimum, he should be able to be a pest,
Yeah, quick.
He's small, but he's quick, and he should, you see him play and think, well, that guy should at least be, look at what someone like Tyson Walker is, an entirely different animal, but look at what somebody like Tyson Walker is able to do at a similar size. But this guy, he looks like he doesn't care to me, which I think is, we look at everything else surrounding him, I don't think that's an unfair read. He takes bad angles, bad positioning. It's just, it's a rough picture. And this is one where I do feel as if whomever he's guarding for Michigan State needs to go at him hard.
Mm-hmm.
Make him try to guard you, because I have not seen it happen yet.
Then it's Nimari Burnett, 6'5", transfer from Alabama, averaging 9.5 points a game, 4.2 rebounds a game, shooting 38, 34, and 76. And about a 2-to-1 assist-turnover ratio with a 65 to 37.
He's their best playmaker. I mean, and he's far from a point guard. So best playmaker other than McDaniel, I should say. I think what's happened here, and we talked about it, I think, for the first game, Burnett started his career out at Texas Tech, then he went to Alabama, and now he's at Michigan. So he's on school 3. And he was a McDonald's All-American coming out of high school. And I think what was behind his decision to transfer is, the way Nate Oates operates is he'll recruit freshmen, and then he'll bring in a lot of transfer guys. He wants to have a lot of competition. And I sense that Burnett, both of their big transfers, Burnett and guy we'll talk about in a second, Camwa, I think came from teams that won a lot last year where they were important parts of those rotations, but they weren't a focal point. They weren't stars. And I think these guys, my sense is they moved because they wanted to be more of a focal point. Burnett's been fine. He's been okay. He's been a solid player. But what I think has been made evident this season is he is not an alpha or even a sidekick guy. He's a guy who basically is what he was at Alabama and what he's been on this team. He's a good third or fourth option. Defensively, though, is where it's been weird, because I really thought he would be a key to. I thought he was a guy that they could put on opposing wings, and he's got good size. He's 6'5", and he's pretty solidly put together, and he's a decent athlete. I thought he was a guy they could use against, the Terrence Shannons of the world and have a chance, that he would give them a very versatile defensive presence, and he hasn't done anything to make them better. It's not all his fault by any means, but he has not made an impact at that end. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think you may see that a little bit with the transfer portal in general, just as you have players become, you're the best of the transfer portal, but it doesn't mean you're the best players available, or I should say best players that are out there. And so I think you can kind of maybe get yourself built up a little bit bigger than what you really are.
Well,
look,
man, it's a guessing game, right? Because you're
Sure.
even when you're talking high major to high major. So you can look at one guy and say, well, this guy was a role player on this team, but he's got the potential. If he's in a different situation, he gets more shots. He's utilized in a way that's a little more conducive to what he does. He's just a better fit, right? That he could be more of a presence in a different situation. And you know what? Sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. I guess my feel is in general, like the players who really stand out, and maybe this is just my dumb general impression, but it's that the ones who really do well transferring, who become stars, are ones who were the best player on their team as they transfer. Jamison Battle, for instance, going to, that was a big pickup for Ohio State, or AJ Storr, or I'm trying to think of there are a number of players that were like, they're best, or they were like certainly emerging as the best players in their team, and then they transfer.
That might be true. With AJ Storr, he was a freshman last year. So I think sometimes it's that you get a guy who's still young, who shows a lot of signs, maybe didn't quite break through as a star, because Storr didn't even average double digits at St. John's last year. So, but you look at the teams that were involved with him, and it was kind of understood. Yeah, this guy is on the come. I mean, it has not been a shocker that he's been productive. Terrence Shannon was kind of that way. If I remember correctly, Terrence Shannon's numbers at Texas Tech, his sophomore year, were not overwhelming, but there was an indication like, yeah, this guy could be primed for a breakout, because a lot of big programs were on him. And sure enough, he did that at Illinois. So yeah, it's just tough to know. And it's looking at mid-major guys that transfer up. Who's going to be a Domas?
Yeah, well, you can never. Yeah,
who's going to be a guy who doesn't do very much? It's tough.
All right, so then moving on to Terrence Williams, 6'6" senior forward, has been actually pretty good this year, averaging 12.4 points a game, with shooting 44, 39, and 79, and pulling down 4.3 rebounds a game.
He is, I think, by far the biggest silver lining from an individual point of view to this season, because he's a guy, when they brought him in, they had a lot of high hopes that he could be sort of a jack of all trades type, maybe not elite in any one area, but could guard a lot of different people, could play a couple different positions, hit a three, score inside, do a lot of different things. And it's been a very up and down career for him, but he has been pretty steady with this team. He shot the ball well. Nobody's particularly good defensively, so you can't say that, but he's given them a little bit of rebounding. And, I think the real question that I had was, okay, they don't have guards, and they don't really even, other than Burnett, and I guess to some extent Llewellyn, they don't really even have wings. So where is this guy going to fit? Because he had always looked to me like, kind of one of these tweeners that, it's kind of a body that suggests he could play the three as well as the four, but not the game. And I think he's actually, he's played the three most of the time this year, and I think he's played well. So he's the one guy I think you can look at and say he outperformed expectations.
And then I think the player that Michigan fans were certainly most excited about transferring this year was Olivier Kimbois, the 6'10" transfer from Tennessee, averaging a little under 15 points a game and 7.2 rebounds a game, shooting 51, 34, and 68.
Yeah. I can't say that it's been a bad season for him individually, but I would say this. Tennessee fans' complaints about him, the primary complaint was one that, I bring up Malik Hall a lot as reference points, but it was a similar thing to Malik Hall, which was, Kemwa got a lot of juice out of his performance in the tournament last year against Duke.
Right.
I forget how many he scored, 28, 30, something like that. Big game.
He was good. Yeah.
And then what gets forgotten is the next game he didn't do very much. And that apparently was a regularly occurring pattern. Like he was sort of feast or famine. He has not been that offensively for Michigan. He's been a relatively steady scorer. And he gets, I mentioned, I think he was looking for a different role. And he found it. He or McDaniel, they're options 1 and 2 for Michigan. So on offense. So he's gotten shots. His scoring has dipped a little bit. He's averaging about 1.5 points less per game than he was heading the first meeting. So that's declined a little bit. I think they hope for a little better perimeter shooting from him. He's been okay, but not great. At times he can get things rolling inside the arc, but it's not super, super consistent. Been a good rebounder. He's given them that. But I think they thought there was the possibility that, hey, he can be the primary guy now. And I think he thought this too. Maybe he gets you 18, 19 a game, and that just hasn't happened. And then defensively, he had a reputation as a very good, very versatile individual defender coming out of a program where they care about defense under Rick Barnes at Tennessee. You got to check to play. And so you look at that and you think, he alone, you're putting him basically in the role that Jet with 9 T's had last year, who couldn't guard his own shadow. Of course they're going to be better. Somehow they're not. Yeah. I don't get it. But I can't say he's been a bad addition, but I can say his addition has not made a bit of difference to making this team better.
Right, because it almost sounds like this team has a little bit of indifference in general. Like, I think that sometimes when you get the defense just bad, it's just because people just don't care. They're just busy getting their own, on offense.
Well, I think there's just there's clearly no accountability, and that is across the board. There's no accountability from the coaching staff, and then there's no accountability within the structure of the team itself. You don't have individuals holding each other accountable. That's
clearly. One of them can't even read a book.
Yeah. Right. This is the only way you get with that kind of team at this level of play, Big Ten, that you have a defense this bad. It has to be that.
Yeah, I mean they're not. They should not be this bad.
No,
there's
no way.
No reason for this.
No
these
way.
Players. Their players are not that. These are decent players, and they're just playing like garbage.
There's no way.
So finally, we come to Terrace Reed, 6'10", sophomore, averaging 8.9 points a game, 7 rebounds a game, a little over a block and a half, shooting 54% from the floor, and slightly better at the line at 58%. And he is a turnover machine.
Yeah, he really is. He struggles with that. But, it's interesting. It was mentioned the other day, and this is not a surprise, that there are rumors flying around. There's a guy named Trilly Donovan who it's a pseudonym, of course, and it has not been as yet identified who that is. I think suspicions are that it's a national college basketball media figure, but it's someone who gets pretty good information at times. And he had been talking this week and mentioned that were there rumors that Dug McDaniel and Terrace Reed are both expected to hit the portal. Well, I don't think that's tremendously shocking if that were to come down the pike. But here's what was interesting. So this was on a Michigan State message board, and I thought some Michigan State fans were like, I don't want any part of Terrace Reed. I don't know if I feel that way. I mean, Michigan State recruited him very hard. And I'm not saying I think that was even be likely or possible, because there's a whole dynamic in there that creates an obstacle right from Jump Street, right? The Michigan State thing. Yeah. And you don't know where that goes. But he's a tough one to diagnose because, the turnovers are horrible. He has not progressed as much as a low post scorer as I thought he might this year. At times he can be effective, and then at other times he struggles. But defensively, man, I was so impressed with him as a defender last year. just at his size, because he's a big bruising kind of guy, but he can really move his feet. I was just, they were playing him a lot at the 4, and he was doing the job. If you remember, he playing at the 4 alongside Dickinson, he was the single biggest factor in a very close game down the stretch when Michigan managed to beat MSU at Chrysler last year. Terrace Reed wore him out because he was rebounding well on the offensive end, and he was good enough defensively that they could keep him in there and he could hang. And keep in mind, that was guarding, Joey Hauser. So I was really impressed. And again, in his case, I'm willing to chalk it up to this is a function of everything that's going on around him rather than an indictment of him individually. He is still blocking shots, but the individual defense is not where it was last year. I still think there's a very good player there. And whether he stays at Michigan or he moves somewhere else, I think there's a chance that gets figured out before he's done. But this has not represented the step forward I thought it might this season.
Well, maybe too, Dickinson was such a black hole of on defense that even a faint light like Reed turns out to actually just be gray.
Well,
but it looked right next to Dickinson's.
I'll tell you though, at least Izzo recruited the hell out of him.
Yeah, sure.
And that's something that he emphasizes. It doesn't always work out as we see, but he emphasizes, generally speaking, at least the potential for that, for lateral movement, being able to extend out on the floor and hang, handling pick and roll, all that stuff. And he wanted him pretty badly as a recruit. He was a guy they prioritized before he made the decision to go to Michigan. And then MSU went with Jackson Kohler and then much later Carson Cooper. All those guys were in the same class. But no, I think it was real. I don't think it was just better by comparison, but it has not progressed positively this year.
Moving into the reserves then, we'll begin with Jaden Llewellyn, 6'2" transfer from Princeton, who we've discussed many times is actually not a point guard, but ends up playing the point because just someone has to do it. He scores 5.1 points a game on 41, 45, and 67 shooting. Limited volume, 16 assists to 25 turnovers, which shows that he's not a very good point guard.
Yeah.
But I would say, I watched one game, I don't know who was against, but he was really good from 3 in that game.
Yeah.
So he's a good shooter if you leave him alone.
He is. And he's a guy, it's hard to say 36% shooting from 3 is a strength, but it's at least not a weakness for Michigan offensively. And he is part of that. And he has shot well. You're absolutely right. There are times where I think they're actually better without Dug, which is a relative thing because they're pretty bad everywhere they are. But there are times when he's hitting, it can at times look like, well, maybe they're better off. And then I see turnovers and I eliminate that thought. But yeah, he's been in a tough situation. He's injury plagued, not miscast for the role that he's in. But he does have the ability to shoot, and credit to him for fighting his way back and being able to play at all, because he's had some pretty serious injuries.
Yeah, no, the fact that he's come back and played and been as effective as he is impressive.
Yep.
Then be Will Cheddar, 6'8" junior, averaging 7 points a game, 2.2 rebounds a game in about 16 minutes, shooting 62, 60, 70. And the reason he doesn't start is because he's really, really bad on defense.
He can shoot. He's proven that. It's not crazy volume, but he can shoot. He can't do anything else. He is a terrible defensive player. You see from the stats, he doesn't rebound well. He's not physical. It's basically shooting, which, credit to him, he couldn't do last year.
Right. So last year he was a total zero.
He found something he could do. Those shooting numbers are pretty crazy. So he's a guy, look, if you're Michigan State, one thing I'm sure Tom Izzo is thinking about at some point is this is a guy that when he's out there, we can't let him get loose for wide open shots.
Right, you don't double off him. Yeah.
No, you can't do that because he could, if you let him, you could be on the wrong end of a 4 for 5 game from 3, and that could make a difference, Then
there's Trey Jackson, 6'10" Seton Hall transfer from Detroit. He's averaging 5 points a game, 2.3 rebounds a game in 15 minutes, shooting 41, 22, and 69. So he's obviously the reserve, I guess, for Terrace Reed.
To some extent, they'll play Campbell at the 5 sometimes too. But look, they added him because he's a Detroit kid. He had shown some ability to shoot from range at times earlier in his career at Seton Hall. He had also, they thought, had some defensive potential. There was even talk about him playing a lot of 3 at the start of this season, and it just has not worked out. He's been very bad defensively. He has not been able to dial in the 3. That's kind of the story.
Yeah. Just because his name is Trey doesn't mean he can shoot, right?
Right.
So finally, George Washington III. He's one of the few freshmen on the team. From Ohio, 6'3", averaging 7 minutes a game. I don't think he even played the last time they played.
He did not.
Lansing.
He did not.
Scores. And that's impressive because they didn't have Dug McDaniel either.
Yeah.
So he averages a little over a point a game on 18, 21, and 83 shooting.
Yeah, the shooting's been horrendous. That tells you something, what you just mentioned, though. Look, he doesn't play steadily. I've got him here because it's possible I could see due to fouls or just the way the game unfolds that maybe he gets a stint here and there, but it's not going to be a lot. He's not ready for prime time. I mean, that was kind of understood, I think, in most quarters when they got him, that he was a borderline to just outside the top 100, and the feeling was, this is going to take a year or two. They think eventually he might be able to be an Eli Brooks type guy who can do a few different things. Eventually develops a shot, which is not evident now, but they'll hope he develops it. Can maybe chip in a little bit defensively, maybe be a decent secondary ball handling option. But right now, it's brutal. It's rough.
Well, I'm going to guess that Will Cheddar is not the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. Brought to you by the Brothers Justice Gutters. So who would you say it is?
Man, I go back and forth on this, but I'm going to say, because it's 2 guys. It's McDaniel and Camwa, right? The 2 leading scorers. I think that's pretty obvious. I'm going to go McDaniel, though, because as I think about what a scenario would be for Michigan to get a win in this game, I can see scenarios where Camwa is not like super dominant, where he's just sort of chipping in, and other guys, like I said, like Cheddar maybe has a huge shooting game, or Terrence Williams really gets it going, or Burnett plays above his head for a night, But I have a hard time seeing a scenario where they do that and Dug McDaniel does not play really well. Yeah. And we've seen it before in this series in recent years where guards have really, I think back last year, Dug McDaniel, my memory is, I look at the stats, my memory is he played pretty well in the game at Chrysler. I remember the year before that, Frankie Collins played very well. Didn't see that coming. We've seen this before. So I'm going to say McDaniel.
All right. So then moving on to our squeegee squad of Grand Rapids, Michigan State player who cleans the glass best. It's currently 5 to 4.5. I finally made some headway against you after being in the desert for a long time. So the squeegee squad of Grand Rapids, obviously your go-to guys for taking care of your windows. That's your house. They can work on pretty much any job. No job's too big or too small. So it's residential, commercial, high rise. They even clean the state capitol windows. I mean, they can do everything. So if you need that done, if you think your screen's a little bit dirty, it looks like a little smudgy on your windows, contact the squeegee squad of Grand Rapids. Or even if you want to get your house spiffed up a little bit, they can take care of it with some power washing. They can go inside, they can go outside. They'll give you quotes for just about anything you want done, and then you can just sort of pick and choose what you want them to do. You can get 15% off. You mentioned Rebound when you get your estimate. You can get your estimate and get a link to that at our support page, where you can all the other great links for our show at thefinalfoursnottheschedule.com/support. All right, so actually, I get to pick the first this time because you got to pick last time. You picked Mahdi, and it has gotten trickier now because I think we're starting to see rotations starting to change a little bit. Kohler's back, Booker's playing a few more minutes, and Carr's less. I'm going to go with Malik Hall because he seems like he had a monster game. I think this is also a scenario where I could see him getting quite a bit of work done as well. So I'm gonna go with Malik. Leave you with a tough one. I'm
gonna go. It's dangerous, but I'm going to go with Madi, and here's my reasoning. I think one thing that Michigan, we've talked about, is a relative strength for them is offensive rebounding. And Madi is the best defensive rebounder among Michigan State's options at the 5. And he's also the strongest of those guys. And strength is a factor against Reed and Camwa, who are pretty well put together guys. And they both have good rebounding numbers. They're
good
both
size,
averaging 7 plus. So I do feel like this is a game where maybe we see Madi as a little more important than he's been over the last few. So I'm going to go with Madi and hope that I get lucky.
All right, we're going to on the 5 keys of the game brought to you by Nudge Printing. Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. They are original sponsors. They do a great work. You get great Spartan apparel. It's where we get all our Tifnot stuff. So I'm wearing it all the time. I'm actually going to be wearing it to the game at Michigan. If you want to actually say hi, I'll be in section 220. So I'll be out there at halftime.
Now you did it.
Now I did it. So yeah, you want to say hi, whatever, it'd be cool talking to some people who might listen to the show, since I think there are going to be a couple Spartan fans in Chrysler.
Yeah.
I would offer to be there before the game, but I know my wife, and there's just no chance we'll be there more than like 3 seconds before tip. So I'll be there at halftime. And so you just want to say hi or something, that's cool. So outside 220, and I'll have my Nudge Printing stuff on there, and you can see, and I'm not going to let you feel it. You just have to buy one yourself to feel how nice and soft and comfortable it is. But I would highly recommend it. High quality screen printed material too. So make sure you head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. 20% off. You type in Final Four. That's just one word at checkout. All right, so 5 keys of the game. Number 1, guarding the arc. So obviously you mentioned before, Michigan is a really good 3-point shooting team, and we've talked about this before.
They're okay. They're okay.
Well, yeah, but that's their main offensive sort of weapon besides, I guess, rebounding.
Yes.
And also we have mentioned many times, you are a bad team, the way you sort of equalize that is, of course, somehow making up by scoring extra points in offense.
Absolutely. And look, there's nobody except Shetter and I guess to some extent Llewellyn, both of whom are not huge volume guys, who you look at and say, wow, that's somebody you really got to lock in on. But you know what? Both of those guys have been great in terms of accuracy. And so you can always be a little bit nervous about them just having one of those games, kind of like Hicks had the other night for Penn State, where they're low volume guys over the course of the season, but they just get loose that night and they end up putting up 6 and they hit 5 of them. You worry about that. And then you look at guys like McDaniel and Camwa to some extent, Burnett to some extent, who are not great shooters on the season, but you know, it wouldn't be totally shocking to see them have an impactful game. You know, over 40 minutes. Could they have a night? Yeah, they could. So to me, this is where the rubber hits the road for Michigan State defensively. You got to do what you can to limit what this team does against you from 3. You know?
Yeah. Well, and I always think too, on the road, you're more susceptible to those role players playing big at home than you are when they're in your building. So
absolutely. Right. Now, the dynamic's going to be a little bit different for this one, I think, than a normal.
Are you
road
saying they're
game.
not having a home game? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not prepared to say quite that, but you know, it's going to be different. But still, just the fact that it's a familiar environment, familiar setting helps. So yeah, this is what I think of your time as this is the primary thing you're worried about when Michigan has the ball. It's the first thing you think about is, God, you can't have, like, you don't want to have a game like Penn State just had against MSU, where they go 13 for 25, you know, or whatever it was, 12 for 23.
So the second key to the game is Road Warriors. Michigan State now has 2 road wins, which is, I think, one more than most Big Ten teams outside of Purdue. But obviously, this is not a regular road game. This is a rivalry game. And no matter how many Spartan fans show up, there's still going to be more Michigan fans, I think, almost for sure. If nothing else, just the students.
Possibly.
So it's still going to be a road environment.
Possibly. I do think this is, you know, the good thing is Michigan State people should be feeling a little more enthusiasm because the team's been playing better of late, immediately, you know, 2 straight wins, and I don't know what it is.
4 of the last 5 or something.
4 of the last 5, and you know, they've been better lately. So enthusiasm should be at a good level for this, and of course, you know, the opportunity to feel like you're going to get a chance to experience a takeover when your team wins in Michigan's gym, that's attractive as well. But it's their building, not yours, and you haven't won there since 2019. We've had whatever it is, 3 straight years, right, of splits in the series where Michigan has won at Chrysler each time, and MSU has won at Breslin. Well, MSU's already won at Breslin again this season, so that makes whatever it is. I think that's 5 years in a row.
Could be
at Breslin, but they haven't had success a lot. And God, is there anybody left from the team that last won? I don't think there is.
Probably not.
Yeah, there wouldn't be, right? There's nobody left who's won in Chrysler. So that, that creates something. Now, again, the dynamic is going to be different than it normally would be because you always have some level of MSU support there, but this is going to, I really do suspect this is going to be different. I think there's going to be a lot of MSU people there. So what effect that has, that remains to be seen. But the bottom line is it's a game away from home that does create some challenges. And, what you hope is that you get a response, much like we saw at Penn State, where they just come out and they play very well pretty much from the early stages and then settle in, and then it just becomes a basketball game.
Yeah, I'm fairly confident that the heckler from last year will not be behind me, so that'll make it a nice visit to Chrysler. So moving on to the third key to the game is defensive rebounding. We mentioned that Michigan is a pretty good offensive rebounding team. Not great, but they're pretty good.
Top 100.
Good enough to cause some problems.
In the top 100, but in the 80s. Again, that's another equation. You want to let an underdog hang in the game with you, keep giving them second chances. The hope for Michigan State is that what you've seen over the last 2 games against a good rebounding opponent in Illinois and a bad one in Penn State is that you start to see some consistency finally arriving in terms of defensive rebounding. That is the challenge. And it's, again, if you're limiting them to one shot consistently, you're going to have a good chance of winning this game, most likely. A lot of other things would have to go wrong.
Well, and a corollary of that, which is the offensive side for Michigan State too, is that there's obviously opportunities there with Michigan being dreadful at defensive rebounding. So maybe getting some extra opportunities. The kickback out threes and stuff like that. Those are
absolutely worthwhile mentioning that. I mean, I always emphasize the defensive side of this for Michigan State because it's where they've been a little worse, and it has seemed to be more directly attributable to losing games when it's happened.
Yes, I agree.
But you're absolutely right. Michigan is a truly awful defensive rebounding team, and MSU absolutely should be able to get second chances.
And the fourth key to the game is pace. We say it pretty much every game that they have to get fast pace, especially, obviously transition, but even when they get into their half court to get into quickly.
Yeah, look, I mean, Michigan is, to put it mildly, is an undisciplined defensive team, right? So how do you best exploit a team that's undisciplined? In my mind, it's get them moving. How do you get them moving? Well, you move bodies and the ball moves fast. You swing it side to side with some intent, some purpose behind it. You make them have to read and react and switch and recover and all of those things. And if they do that with consistency, Michigan State will be very hard for Michigan to stop. Transition also comes into play because, again, this is not a disciplined team. So they've had issues in transition defense pretty much all year. Michigan State is the best, in my mind, the best transition team in this league. And certainly even statistically, you'd say they are one of the better transition teams in the country. It doesn't always feel that way, but statistically, the number of points they get in transition, it's the case. They're a top 25 team nationally in that regard. So the formula is there. If Michigan State plays fast, they're going to be tough for Michigan to beat.
I always feel it's impressive that Michigan State can manage to crack the top 25 in the Big Ten, which is like designed to stop that from happening pretty much.
But I will say, this year it doesn't feel normally the
I know what you're saying.
coaching.
I agree.
Coaching is so good, the scouting is so good that you just expect that teams are just not going to let you run. This is something we talk about all the time out. Usually it's just a relief when then MSU gets into the tournament because they're finally facing teams that don't get back well. But I will say this year, there seems to be some of it is some coaching changes. Penn State now wants to play really fast, so that's different. You've had real slippage in programs like Michigan and Ohio State defensively. That's part of it. I was always prone to giving that stuff up, so that's no different. But even a team like Illinois really is intent on playing fast. But I think they're a lot more disciplined than some of those other teams I just mentioned. But you saw the game the other day, last weekend. You can get into kind of a running game with them at times because they do want to play fast. So it's been available more than I think we're used to seeing this year. But kudos to Michigan State for taking advantage of it. And it's something that hopefully we see a lot of in this game.
And the fifth and final key is balance. So again, not to sit behind the arc or just layups. You got to get both ways.
So Michigan State in these 2 wins they've had last week has averaged 10.5 3-point attempts per game.
Yeah, that's got to be really low.
It is
nationwide,
and they're low nationally. They're outside the top 300 in 3-point attempts.
That's pretty low
for the season. Their percentage has gotten better and better and better and better to the point that I think they're inside the top 30 now nationally. I mean, it's really gotten. They are a good, by any measure, they are a very good 3-point shooting team. But here's the thing. Even with that low number, and you might say, and it's not an unreasonable thought, say, well, God, why isn't MSU taking more threes? They shoot them well. I'm going to disagree with that in this sense. I think they have found an offensive approach that definitely against a certain type of opponent, they are well advised to stick with. So what have we seen the last 2 games? We've seen teams that, to some extent, less so Penn State, but definitely Illinois, and Michigan does pretty well with it too. Defensively, they work to try to take away threes. So part of it is that, but all of these teams, and Michigan maybe worst of all, shows real vulnerability against the 2. So what has Michigan State done? They have been focused on getting the ball to the rim. They've done that by penetration. They've done that via post-ups. They've done it by getting into transition. They've done it a lot of different ways, but the bottom line is that, and they've also been drawing fouls. They've also been getting themselves to the line. They really did that well against Illinois, to a lesser extent against Penn State, but still enough. I think given the really serious weakness Michigan has defending against 2s, they would be well advised to do something similar to what we've seen over the last week in these 2 previous games. So that means the guards are intent on getting the ball into the lane, getting the ball to the rim, and they're also mixing in, hopefully, some really good post play out of Malik Hall. This is going to be interesting because, again, Michigan said it 100 different ways. They're a truly bad defensive team, but one-on-one, Cam Wad defending against Malik Hall on the blocks will be interesting because Cam Wad's got a size advantage. So Malik, unlike that Penn State game and unlike certain matchups against Illinois even, he's not just going to be able to just go through Cam Wad easily and overpower him.
Right.
But with the kind of footwork and quick release that we've seen lately from Malik, can he still be effective down there? Yeah, I think he can. But that's going to be an interesting one to watch. But regardless, I think Michigan's perimeter guys are going to have a hell of a time keeping MSU's guards out of the lane. I just don't think they're built to do it very well. We haven't seen indications that they can do it very well. So as long as MSU's mentality is right, that should lead to good things. And then hopefully that also leads to some open jumpers. and you start to get production there. But you want to see that balance. What you don't want to do is see MSU just going hog wild from three. I don't think that's the offensive approach you want to see.
Yeah, unless they're left wide open, which is
then you got to take them.
Or the transition threes, like with Akins and things like that. Yeah, but
But I'm saying
sure.
where you're just settling for shots. That's what you don't want to see. This is not a team to settle against.
I would say in the Penn State game, the second half, it was a little bit like that. There were a lot of hand grenade threes at the end of the shot clock and stuff. So they had to avoid those sorts of looks.
Yep. But again, this team does not do a good job of extending its defensive possessions, meaning Michigan. Teams are really playing fast against them. So there's not much of an excuse going into this one for that to happen very often.
Well, this game is going to be late on Saturday. It's kind of a featured game. This is the game too that if it wasn't Michigan, I'd feel a lot more confident about a big win for Michigan State. But I think just the rivalry and Michigan's going to play hard, probably play more together than they have most of the time this season. It's going to be a tougher game, and they tend to be a really good first half team. So I guess in some ways you just want to make sure you stay in contact in the first half. And be
all good.
If you're down, just buy a bucket or two, and then kind of turn it on the second half.
All true. And it's why you have some level of nervousness, because everything on paper says, oh, this is a double-digit win, right?
Right.
But that factor, the fact that none of the guys on this team know what it's like to win in that building, which isn't the end of the world, but it's, you feel better if they know what it's like, and so that, that big, and the fact that you would expect that if Michigan's ever going to find a moment this year to rally around, I mean, they did get the win over Wisconsin, but this would be one where you would expect, like, if they've got any reservoir of pride and any kind of desire to make a positive statement for their coaches, this would be the one, right? Of course, what mitigates that is they got a lot of guys who don't really know the rivalry very well. What does Cameron know about playing Michigan State? What does Burnett know about playing Michigan State? Llewellyn. I mean, Dug McDaniel and Travis and Terrace Reed have played them, a couple of times, but that's it. There is not, let's put it this way, they don't have the Halls, the Holgard. I mean, they got Terrence Williams. He's the one guy who's been in it a lot. They don't have Hall, Holgard, Motti, Akins, even Tyson Walker. Tyson Walker is playing his 6th game career against them. That's a lot. And so that makes it interesting, that dynamic. Like, okay, you would think going into it, this would be a game that if they're ever going to summon it up and play hard for 40 minutes and show some of that self-belief and dignity and all those things, that it happens now. But that's assuming that those guys collectively have an understanding of this the way that you would hope. And there's not a lot of evidence of that. There's not a ton of reason for them to feel that way, unless their coaching staff is somehow able to really transmit that to them and get them to believe. So we'll see. But we're all going to be nervous because it's a game with no upside for Michigan State. Almost none.
Yeah. Right, exactly. We didn't even mention Juwan Howard, but I guess he's questionable. It's interesting. Actually, I was just looking at the injury. Howard. Yeah.
Jace,
sorry.
He's been hurt and sick, and I don't know if I'd expect to see him.
Also of note, Steven Izzo is also listed as questionable. So if you have to, maybe you want to change your betting plans for the game too. So
but it would be. I'll tell you where that might be interesting. If this thing does get ugly, then there might not be an opportunity for him to have a second score this year. That's possible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This may be the chance.
We'll hope for the best.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think we'll get out of here. We'll see you guys after the game. I'd be remiss not to mention my wife's father-in-law passed away from struggle with pancreatic cancer, and he's a big Spartan fan, Spartan alum, and so we'll say goodbye to Bob Sr. Also, interestingly, they were getting his suit ready for what he'd wear, and in his pocket was a prayer from the funeral for my son that he had kept with him for the last 5 years, and so it's kind of cool. So I know they'll both be up there in the Celestial Palace cheering on Michigan State on Saturday. So till next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.